Liam Harrow thought the abandoned top floor of Westbridge Hostel would be the perfect place to study in peace. By the third night, he wasn't studying anymore. He was counting the wet footprints that appeared around his bed. Always one more than the night before. When I first arrived at the hostel, I thought the building looked older than anything I had ever seen still in use. The bricks were dark, almost black with age, and the narrow windows looked like watchful eyes peering down at the students dragging their luggage inside. The top floor was where they had placed me, far away from the main stairwell, at the very end of a hallway that felt strangely cut off from the rest of the place. My footsteps echoed too loudly against the wooden floorboards, and every sound seemed to travel along the corridor, bouncing off the cracked plaster walls before disappearing into the corners. My room was small, with a single narrow bed pressed against the wall, a metal wardrobe that rattled when I touched it, and a desk wedged beneath a crooked window. The glass of the window was cloudy, and no matter how hard I wiped it, it wouldn't clear. The air in the room was stale, carrying a faint smell of damp wood and something metallic, like the scent that lingers after touching old coins. Unpacking felt like a chore I had to finish quickly. Something about the room made me want to spend as little time inside as possible. The ceiling above my bed had a long brown stain, twisting in odd patterns like veins, and I found myself staring at it too long. There was a single light bulb hanging from the center of the ceiling, its thin cord swaying slightly even though the window was shut. I told myself it was just a draft, though I couldn't feel any air moving. That first evening passed slower than I expected. From my window, I could see the main courtyard below where some students were sitting in groups, laughing and talking. Their voices rose and fell like background noise I couldn't quite connect to. Up here, it felt quieter, the sound fading before it reached me, as if the walls absorbed it. I noticed how quickly the light outside dimmed, how the shadows in my room stretched and changed shape as the sun sank. By the time I switched on the light bulb, the floorboards had begun making their own noises. Soft creaks and occasional sharp cracks that made me turn my head more than once. When night fully settled, the building's silence became heavier. I sat on the bed with my back to the wall, scrolling on my phone to distract myself, but my attention kept shifting to the door. The strip of light from the hallway that leaked in through the gap at the bottom was thin, barely enough to make out the edge of my shoes by the door. I noticed it once, then again, and then I couldn't stop looking at it. That's when I heard a faint, slow dragging sound from somewhere beyond the door. Not footsteps exactly, but something moving across the wood, scraping faintly. It was steady, unhurried, almost like someone shuffling forward barefoot. My breath slowed as I strained to listen. The dragging sound grew louder for a moment, then softer, then stopped entirely. I kept staring at the strip of light under the door. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but I was sure I saw it something blocking the light. A shadow, thin at first, then growing longer, stretching unnaturally, spilling into my room without the door opening. I couldn't understand it. The door handle never moved, yet the shadow seemed to push forward, crawling toward the edge of my bed. The light bulb above me flickered once, twice, then steadied, but in that brief moment of darkness, I thought I saw the shadow split into thin, finger-like shapes. I wanted to move, to grab my phone, to do anything, but my body stayed frozen. My eyes were fixed on that shadow until, slowly, it began to retreat, slipping back toward the hallway in the same dragging rhythm I had first heard. The strip of light under the door returned to normal, and the corridor outside seemed empty again. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening for another sound, but the silence had returned, heavy and complete. It was only when I finally forced myself to lie down that I realized the shadow I'd seen on the floor didn't quite match the shape of any human I had ever known. It was too long, too thin, and it moved as if it was searching for something. The morning light came weakly through the cloudy glass, as if the sun itself was struggling to reach this part of the building. I sat up slowly, my back stiff from sleeping in one position all night. The room felt colder than it should have been, and my breath made faint mist in the air. I told myself it was just the old building holding in the night chill, but it didn't explain why the rest of the hostel seemed warmer when I stepped into the hallway. I headed to the bathroom at the far end of the corridor, the kind with long mirrors and old, chipped sinks. At first glance it looked empty, but when I caught sight of my reflection, my chest tightened. The mirror above the sink was smeared with small handprints, dozens of them, pale and faint, like the marks left when wet fingers touch glass. They were too small to be from any of the students here. The prints trailed downward, clustered toward the middle, and then faded as they reached the bottom edge of the glass. I leaned closer, half expecting them to vanish like condensation, but they were dry, almost as if they had been there for years. I turned away quickly, not wanting to know who or what had left them. The day passed in a haze. I wandered between classes in the dining hall, avoiding the thought of going back to my room too early. The more time I spent in other parts of the hostel, the more I noticed how isolated the top floor felt. The sounds of people downstairs, doors shutting, voices, music never seemed to carry upward, even when I climbed the stairs. There was a point midway where everything behind me felt far away, like I had stepped into another place entirely. That evening, I hesitated outside my room, staring at the door before unlocking it. The faint metallic smell I'd noticed on the first day was stronger now, like rust and damp earth. I left the window open for a while, but the air that drifted in didn't carry any warmth. It felt like breathing in the cold from a cellar. Night came quietly, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. I sat on the bed, my phone in my hand, trying not to glance at the door. I kept telling myself that nothing had really happened last night, that I'd imagined the shadow under the door. The building's old, it makes noises, the light plays tricks easy enough to explain away when it's daytime, but when the lights dimmed and the corridors outside fell silent, I couldn't convince myself anymore. It started again around midnight. This time it wasn't a dragging sound but something softer, a faint, irregular rhythm like breathing. It wasn't coming from the hallway, it was coming from inside the walls. I froze, holding my breath to make sure I wasn't just hearing my own. Sound was there, dry, shallow breaths, slow and deliberate, as if someone was leaning close on the other side of the plaster. I pressed my back against the bed frame, eyes darting around the room. The breathing seemed to shift locations, moving from one wall to another, sometimes directly behind me, sometimes near the wardrobe. The longer I listened, the more I realized it wasn't just breathing. Every so often there was a faint scrape, as if something's nails were brushing against wood or plaster. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving the silence heavier than before. I thought maybe it was over, but then the bed moved. Not much. Just a slight dip, enough for me to feel the mattress sink on one side. My stomach clenched. I could feel the pressure, as if someone had just sat down beside me. The air was so cold it felt like it was seeping into my bones. I didn't dare turn my head. I stared straight ahead at the wall opposite me, trying to focus on the faint patterns of cracks in the paint, pretending not to feel the weight pressing down on the bed. It stayed like that for what felt like minutes, the silence stretching, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. Then, slowly, the pressure eased. The mattress lifted, the coldness in the air faded, and the sound of breathing was gone. I lay back cautiously, my muscles aching from staying tense for so long. My eyes closed for just a moment, but when I opened them again, the window was shut. I knew I hadn't closed it. The next few days passed with a dull, uneasy rhythm. I tried to keep myself busy, staying out of the room as much as possible, but the top floor had a way of pulling me back whether I wanted it to or not. Each time I climbed the final set of stairs, a chill would settle into my skin, as though the air here belonged to a different season. My breath would always seem a little heavier by the time I reached my door. It wasn't just the temperature, there was a dampness in the room, now faint at first, then more noticeable with each morning. My sheets felt clammy, like they'd been pulled from a cold basement, and there was a faint smell of wet earth clinging to them. I tried washing them, but the scent returned almost immediately, as if it had soaked into the fabric itself. The ceiling stain above my bed looked darker, its twisting vein-like patterns, spreading a little more each day. Sometimes, when I stared too long at it, I thought I saw the faintest shimmer of moisture along its edges, like water trying to seep through. The floor, too, was different. A thin film of dust seemed to gather quickly despite my attempts to clean it. And more than once I noticed small oval-shaped impressions in it. They were faint, no bigger than the footprint of a child, and they often appeared in small circles around my bed. At first I brushed it off as my own footsteps, but I knew they didn't match. My steps were longer, wider apart. These were close together, deliberate, as though someone or something had been pacing in place while I slept. One evening, as I returned from the common room, I stopped dead halfway down the hall. My room door was moving. Slowly, with a deliberate creak, it was closing. I had locked it before leaving. My first thought was that the lock was faulty, but as I watched, the movement stopped halfway. The door frozen as though it had sensed I was there. The metallic smell, sharper than ever, drifted into the hallway. I forced myself forward, my keys trembling in my hand. The lock turned without resistance, though I knew I had bolted it earlier. Inside, the air was heavy and still, carrying the cold in a way that seemed to press into my chest. The wardrobe door was slightly ajar, something I never left open. I pushed it shut without looking inside, telling myself it was just a draft from the window, even though the window was closed. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay with my eyes open, watching the faint movement of shadows across the ceiling. Around midnight, I heard it again, a sound unlike the breathing from before. This was softer, wet somehow, like something chewing slowly in the dark. I sat up, trying to locate it. It wasn't coming from the hallway, it was coming from the closet. The chewing sound stopped the moment I looked toward it. The wardrobe door was closed, but a faint vibration seemed to pass through it, as if something inside had shifted its weight. My pulse hammered in my ears. I kept staring, waiting for the door to move, but it stayed perfectly still. Minutes passed, then maybe an hour, I couldn't tell anymore. When I finally lay back down, I turned to face the wall, away from the closet. My eyes felt heavy, but I didn't let them close all the way. That's when I heard it again. Only this time it wasn't from inside the closet. It was right next to my bed, low to the ground, the same slow chewing sound, wet and deliberate. I stayed completely still, the muscles in my neck aching from the effort. My breathing was shallow, careful not to make a sound. The chewing continued for a while, slow and steady, before fading into silence. When morning came, the air in my room was damp again, and the smell of earth was stronger. As I got out of bed, I noticed a small, dark smear on the floor by the wardrobe, something that looked like mud, but when I leaned closer I saw it glistened faintly, as if it wasn't mud at all. I began avoiding my room as much as I could, but the exhaustion was catching up with me. Even when I stayed in the common areas until late at night, the moment I climbed the last flight of stairs to the top floor, the cold would settle in my bones and the heavy silence would wrap itself around me. I started feeling it even before unlocking my door, a faint prickling sensation at the back of my neck, as though something on the other side was aware I had returned. Inside, the damp smell had deepened, mixed now with something sour, almost like decay. My clothes in the wardrobe carried it too. No matter how many times I washed them, I kept the window open for hours each day, but instead of freshening the air, it only let in a strange, stagnant breeze that seemed to carry whispers I could never quite make out. Sometimes I thought the sound was just in my head, but other times I was certain it came from a corner of the room, moving slowly from one side to the other. It wasn't just sounds anymore. My eyes began to catch fleeting movement, shapes no taller than my knee darting past the edge of my vision, disappearing before I could turn my head. I convinced myself it was imagination until something else happened to prove it wasn't. One morning, I woke to find long, thin strands of hair arranged neatly across my pillow. They were black, damp, and clung together as if freshly pulled from water. They weren't mine. That night I couldn't sleep, even with the light on. My attention kept drifting to the corners of the ceiling, where the shadows seemed thicker. The ceiling above the bed had started to change. The old brown stain wasn't just spreading anymore, it was swelling. A slight bulge had formed, sagging downward as though something on the other side was pressing against it. Around 2 in the morning I heard it, the faintest creak, directly above me. It was slow and deliberate, not the random shifting of an old building. Then came a second creak, further along, as if whatever was up there was crawling toward the spot above my bed. The bulge shifted slightly, and a droplet of cold water fell onto my forehead. I froze, my eyes locked on the ceiling. Another droplet followed, sliding down the side of my face. The air in the room grew heavy, and I could hear the faint click of something against the wood, like small nails tapping as they moved. The bulge in the ceiling swelled lower until I could see the dampness spreading along its edges. A third drop fell, this one landing on my lips. It tasted metallic, like rust mixed with something else. I sat up abruptly, heart pounding, and backed against the far wall, keeping my eyes on that dark, swollen patch above the bed. For several long minutes, nothing else happened. The ceiling seemed to hold its breath. Then, without warning, the bulge twitched as if something had dragged its hand or face along the inside surface. The movement was slow but purposeful, tracing across in uneven lines, the tapping sound growing slightly louder before it faded away. I didn't go back to bed after that. I stayed against the wall until the first light of dawn began to touch the cloudy window. Even in the daylight, the bulge remained, glistening faintly, the ceiling looking ready to tear at the slightest pressure. When I finally stepped outside the room to leave for class, I noticed the dust in the hallway right outside my door. The thin layer had been disturbed, small footprints, the same childlike size I'd seen before, circled in uneven patterns. They led directly from my door to the far end of the hall, where the shadows seemed deeper than they should have been. That night, I decided I wouldn't look at the ceiling at all. But as I lay in bed, staring at the wall, I felt a single drop of water land on my shoulder. I knew the bulge was above me again, waiting. By the 5th night, my body felt drained in a way sleep couldn't fix. The cold in my room had stopped feeling like a temperature and more like a presence, something that clung to me, following me even when I went downstairs. I stopped trying to tell myself it was just an old building. Old buildings don't watch you. Old buildings don't leave wet hair on your pillow or move when you're not looking. The lock on my door had given up entirely. No matter how I replaced it, the latch would hang loose, useless against whatever wanted to come in. I started placing my desk chair under the handle at night, but even that felt more like a false comfort than protection. The air always seemed heavier after dark, pressing against my chest until breathing became shallow. I tried keeping the window open to let in some kind of relief, but the wind that drifted through was wrong, thick and damp, carrying a smell of wet soil and something faintly sweet, like rotting flowers. That evening, I decided I couldn't stay there anymore. My suitcase was already packed before the sun went down. I went to leave, but when I reached the front gate of the hostel, it was locked shut with heavy chains. No one was at the reception desk. I searched for another way out, back exits, service doors, even the old fire escape, but every path was blocked or sealed. It was as if the building itself had decided I wasn't leaving. When I finally returned to my room, the hallway lights were flickering. The shadows cast along the walls seemed to stretch toward me, bending unnaturally, their edges too sharp. Inside my room, the light bulb hummed faintly, swaying as if touched. I pushed the chair back under the door handle and sat on the bed, telling myself I would stay awake until morning. The bulb went out sometime after midnight. The pop of it bursting left me in complete darkness, my ears straining for any sound. Slowly, my vision adjusted, enough to make out the faint outline of the window and the darker shape of the wardrobe in the corner. That's when I saw it. Something was crouched at the end of my bed. It was small child-sized, but its limbs were wrong, bent at odd angles as if the joints weren't where they should be. Its skin was slick and gray, catching faint glimmers from the moonlight. The head tilted to one side in an unnatural curve, like the neck was too loose to hold it straight. I didn't move, barely even breathed. It stayed there, unmoving, as though waiting for me to do something. Then it began to crawl forward. The movement was slow, deliberate, the joints of its arms bending backward as it pulled itself closer. Its head stayed tilted, and I could hear faint, wet clicks from somewhere inside its throat. It stopped halfway up the bed and leaned in, the smell of damp earth and something rotting flooding my nose. My eyes locked on its face, or what I thought was its face, until I realized it wasn't a face at all. It was a smooth, gray surface that began to shift, the skin stretching as something pushed from inside. Slowly, impossibly, the shape pressing forward took form: eyes, a nose, a mouth. My mouth. I stared at it, frozen, as my own face stared back at me from its head, the expression empty but somehow knowing. Its lips curled, not into a smile but into something wider, stretched far beyond what a mouth should be. Before I could move, its hand shot forward, fingers cold and damp, pressing against my chest. The weight of it pinned me in place. The edges of my vision began to darken, and the last thing I saw before the blackness closed in was my own face leaning closer, the mouth opening wider, as if it was about to swallow me whole. When I woke, if I had ever truly slept, the bed was empty. The room was silent. But in the mirror above the desk, the reflection staring back at me wasn't mine.